This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.
And I'm Juan Gonzalez. Welcome to all of our listeners and viewers around the country and around the world. The Obama administration is reportedly close to beginning arming the Syrian rebels with lethal weaponry in their fight against President Bashar al-Assad. The Washington Post reports President Obama will make a final decision in the coming weeks on what one official described as assistance that has a direct military purpose. Syrian rebels have already asked Western backers for anti-tank weapons and surface-to-air missiles. Fighting in Syria over the past 2 years has already left an estimated 70,000 people dead and created 1.2 million refugees. At a news conference on Tuesday, Obama cited reports that chemical weapons had been used inside Syria.
What we now have is evidence that chemical weapons have been used inside of Syria, but we don't know how they were used, when they were used, who used them. We don't have a chain of custody that establishes what exactly happened. And when I am making decisions about America's national security and the potential for taking additional action in response to chemical weapon use, I've got to make sure I've got the facts.
President Obama went on to say the use of chemical weapons would be a game changer.
By game changer, I mean that we would have to rethink the range of options that are available to us. Now, we're already, as I said, invested in trying to bring about a solution inside of Syria. Obviously, there are options that are available to me that are on the shelf right now that we have not deployed, and that's a spectrum of options. As early as last year, I asked the Pentagon, our military, our intelligence officials to prepare for me what options might be available. And I won't go into the details of what those options might be, but clearly that would be an escalation, in our view, of the threat to the security of the international community, our allies, and the United States, and that means that there are some options that we might not otherwise exercise that we would strongly consider.
For more on Syria, we're joined by Tracy Shelton, Global Post senior correspondent covering Syria and the wider Middle East. She just returned from Aleppo, Syria. She's joining us from Antakya, Turkey. Last month, she won a George Polk Award for, quote, communicating the human tragedy of the conflict in Syria in a way that's impossible to ignore or forget. Her latest piece is called Syria, the horrific chemical weapons attack that probably wasn't a chemical weapon attack. Tracy Shelton, welcome to Democracy Now! Explain this latest piece. What evidence do you have of what took place?
Well, I visited the sites of the alleged chemical weapon attacks and met with victims, with survivors, with rescuers, doctors. And it does, to me, it's clear that there was some kind of chemical that was used. It was quite a small scale in the attacks that I saw. And the effects of it were clearly from some chemical, but they didn't appear to be as severe as they would if it was one of these banned chemicals that the world is afraid of, that the regime in Syria do have access to. Most of the people survived and recovered within 5 days, whereas if it was a gas like sarin gas, which there was a lot of talk about it being this, there wouldn't have been survivors to this extent.
And Tracy Shelton, you also talk about the not only the health effects, but the canisters that were recovered that carried the chemicals that seemed more in line with tear gas canisters than, for instance, sarin. Or could you talk about the delivery instruments that were used for these chemicals?
Yeah, they were quite small little plastic canisters. They did also have a metal section, which it seemed to be some kind of small explosive, maybe designed to spread it. The witnesses and neighbours had heard a helicopter coming overhead, so it was believed by everyone on the ground that it was dropped by air. Which would seem to indicate the regime is that they're the only ones that have access to helicopter. The one I spent most of my time researching, the attack, was in the Kurdish region, who haven't actually sided clearly either with the government or with the FSA, with the opposition groups. they've kind of kept a stand in the middle. So there was a lot of speculation as to who would have attacked this area. But yeah, since it did appear to come from an airstrike, it does indicate the regime. But it was the gas. The effects of this gas were not really as harsh as it would have been if it was sarin gas. Also, it seems a bit more worse than tear gas, but no one has actually managed to identify what this chemical was yet.
Tracy, you begin your piece, the horrific chemical weapons attack that probably wasn't a chemical weapons attack, by saying Yasser Yunus went to bed around midnight, April 13th. When he woke up 2 days later, he was in a hospital and his wife and 2 young children were dead. Can you tell us the story from there?
Yes, well, he was actually dropped into their home. It fell onto the courtyard stairs just outside. So when he woke up, he'd opened the door. His only recollection was seeing some smoke, and then he was in a coma for the next few days. From there, I spoke with the neighbours who had come in to help, and they'd found the two young boys were dead. The mother later died in hospital, so that was the whole family that was inside the house. The neighbours that came in to help them, they also fell ill. Most of them were in a coma also for a day or two. And then the next party to arrive were the Kurdish police and members of the Upper forces, the Kurdish militia forces that controlled the area. And many of them also fell ill, up till the next people arriving on the scene like 3 hours later. And even doctors that treated these victims after they were moved to the hospital in Afrin. Many of the doctors even suffered effects, but much more mild effects. So it definitely indicates some kind of chemical is working here, because none of these people had injuries from any kind of explosion. It was just a chemical reaction.
Tracy Shelton, you've also, in other articles in the conflict zone, dealt with the al-Nusra group. The United States calls them terrorists. You say in one of your articles that one person's terrorist is another person's freedom fighters. Could you talk about your interviews and the time you spent with the al-Nusra group?
Yeah, it's such a complicated situation in Syria, and I guess the main purpose of that comment was to show that the word terrorist is often used. It was always used politically, and depends on what side you're on. And it doesn't mean that whether they are terrorists or not. It's just it's a term that's used for. If it's someone who stands against what you stand for, this is the term you use to describe them. President Bashar uses the term to describe the whole opposition forces. America, al-Nusra, because they are affiliated, and they've recently come out to say that they're affiliated with Al-Qaeda. So I mean, many of these groups in the opposition on the government side and throughout Syria are using methods that could be described as terrorism.
Can you explain the difference between sarin gas and the kind of gas that you're talking about? What is legal, what is illegal?
There's the convention in I think 1993 banned listed a certain amount of chemical weapons that were banned, the ones that were much more fatal than others. There's certain things like tear gas that have been banned in certain countries, but not under this international convention. So yeah, I think what the thing that a lot of people don't realise is that we're not just talking about any chemical, but certain chemicals that have been internationally banned and do have a very high death rate when they're used.
I wanted to ask you to respond to reports about sarin gas being used. First, this is Syria's UN Ambassador Bashar Jafri speaking at the United Nations.
The Syrian government has always emphasized in Damascus, the capital, as well as in here, that it will not use, if it possesses, any chemical weapons against its own people. And I stress this point, which has been highly controversial and manipulated by the enemies of Syria to serve their hidden agendas.
However, medical personnel, some, are saying the exact opposite. This is Dr. Ubada al-Abrash, a Syrian volunteer doctor working for the Union of Syrian Medical Relief Organizations, which runs hospitals for the Syrian opposition.
When wounded people arrived at the crossing, they were suffering from suffocation, breathing difficulties, they were vomiting, and large tears welled up in their eyes. These are symptoms of chemical gas. When the patients arrived after the initial examination, we took blood samples from them.
That was Dr. Ubada al-Abrash. Tracy Shelton, your response to what he says.
I got similar accounts to when I arrived at different hospitals from medical professionals and from rescuers. People were definitely suffering from a chemical reaction, but as I said, until now it hasn't actually been identified what chemical it was. So until we get someone to officially test these chemicals, and the strange thing is the people that I spoke with in Afrin actually have the canisters from this attack, but they couldn't find anyone internationally to test it. So I think I'm not really sure why no one has really stepped up to do that, but I think it's a very important thing that this chemical being used is identified before we jump to conclusions about anything.
Tracy Shelton, let's turn to one of your video reports from September, Life and Death in Aleppo. Here you take viewers on patrol with a group of rebel soldiers telling the story of Isa, Ahmed and Qasim in the days before, and then at the very moment they're killed in their back alley post by a tank blast.
The rebel fighters manning this 2-block stretch of back street are friends. For several weeks, the men of this battalion in Aleppo have made the street their battleground, their social club, their kitchen, their home. Most were civilians before the revolution began last April. Some were teachers, students, labourers. Others joined the opposition after defecting from the government army, like these men.
We have been with the freedom fighters for 8 months. Why do we do this? For God, and to overthrow the regime.
Some moments they seem like any group of friends anywhere, chatting, laughing, drinking tea, reminiscing about family and friends back home. But here, all that can change in an instant. In the mornings they clean up before breakfast. But this morning they were caught off guard.
Bring an ambulance, bring an ambulance, for God's sake. Oh, Mahmoud.
Isa, the group's leader and father of 3, his 17-year-old brother Ahmed, and Sheikh Mahmoud, father of a newborn baby, were killed in the blast.
And this is another report by Tracy Shelton of Global Post from Syria in September called Surviving Aleppo. Here she shows the horrific aftermath of a helicopter bombing attack and goes shoulder to shoulder with those digging through the rubble to find survivors.
A Syrian army helicopter bombed this 3-story building Monday, leaving rubble crushing down onto 2 young families.
Searching through the rubble here. So far they've found 8 bodies, 7 young children and their father. They're still searching for the mother underneath the rubble.
But then, just as all hope seemed lost, a tiny miracle emerged from the destruction. 1-year-old Hassan survived without a scratch in a blast that killed his parents, his cousins and all his siblings. As doctors examined him at a neighbouring hospital, rescuers described how he was found. His mother had used her body to shelter him from the falling concrete. He was discovered unscathed, still cradled in her lifeless arms.
He stayed for around 6 hours underground until we got him out with our simple tools, and thank God he survived.
As we wrap up, Tracy Shelton, you've spent most of the last year in Syria. You're now in Turkey. You've just come out. Tomorrow is World Press Freedom Day. Can you talk about the dangers of being a journalist, the journalists who've died, and what you think needs to happen?
It's definitely difficult to work in Syria, and it is getting harder as the opposition becomes a lot where the extremist elements are growing. The revolutionary aspects of the revolution are slowly being taken over by other agendas. And yeah, it's not as, it was never safe to operate in Syria, but now it's very difficult to know where the dangers are coming from. But yeah, so there are a lot of precautions that you need to take. One of my colleagues has been missing for, I think, 5 months now, James Foley, and many others as well have been killed, injured, missing. So yeah, it's a difficult place to work, and one that requires a lot of planning and a lot of precautions.
And what needs to happen in Syria?
I don't know. I don't know what the answer is. It's a big mess now, and I think international intervention could have worked maybe a year ago, but now it's become very complicated. There's a lot of elements involved, and they're talking about the possibility of arming the rebels now. Obviously, something has to happen as far as yes, the Syrian regime are killing many people, and this fighting is killing many people. But the answer is very complicated. You have an opposition that is fractionated, and they all have different agendas. They have different affiliations, many with outside groups. So it's a very complicated question. And I think that even once the regime falls, the fighting is probably not going to stop for quite a while.
Tracy Shelton, we want to thank you for being with us. Global Post senior correspondent covering Syria and the wider Middle East. She's just returned from Aleppo, Syria, joined us from Antakya, Turkey. Last month, she won a George Polk Award for her coverage of Syria. This is Democracy. Thanks so much for watching this report from Democracy Now!, your daily independent global news hour. We don't accept advertising or corporate funding, but rather rely on donations from viewers like you. Please make your contribution by visiting democracynow.org. We need your support today to keep bringing you this hard-hitting, in-depth reporting.